for you, if you could only pass on one piece of wisdom to somebody that's taken a CX leadership role recently, what would that be?
So one of the things that companies have been doing lately is they create this journey map, the customer experience journey. And that is from the moment the customer thinks about doing business with you, not just as actually doing business with you. There's the concept called the zero moment of truth. The moment of truth in business, Jan Carlson came up with that. Anytime a customer comes into contact with any aspect of a business, they form an impression. So manage that interaction. But even before the customer even knows what company they're going to go with, they may go to Google and start looking around. They don't even know it's you they're going to land on. So what experience could you create in that process? That is, as soon as they click on a link that's on a Google search, they come to your website. Do they immediately, what's the feeling they get? Anyway, every interaction point, every touch point the customer has, especially the human-to-human touch points, map those out. Now that's at the top line. Underneath the touch points, and this is where many companies, they stop at the top line. But what I want to do is I want to create a culture where every single person knows what their contribution to the customer experience is. So underneath the top line, I have what I call impact points. I'll give you an example. Since Jan Carlson came up with the moment of truth concept on the airlines, Scandinavian Airlines, if you wanted, back in the 80s when he took over, if you wanted to make a reservation, you had to pick up and make a phone call. Now that's a main touch point, a main moment of truth, as he calls it. On the day of departure, you check your bags at the curb, you see somebody at the ticket counter, you see somebody at the gate. All of these are major touch points. But let's talk about checking that bag at the curb. You check that bag at the curb, and 4 hours later, you're at your destination, and you walk out, and there's a baggage carousel, and here comes your bag coming off the conveyor belt and almost directly into your hands. Again, by the way, another touch point. If that touch point, by the way, is failed and the bag doesn't show up, that's a moment of misery, as I like to call it. So let's assume it happens. Well, what happens behind the scenes? From the time I actually handed the bag to the baggage handler at the airport and I see it going off on the conveyor belt down into the bowels of the airport, something is going to happen to get it to appear at the baggage carousel 1,000 miles later. And that is a lot of people moving my bag from this cart to that cart, to getting it on the plane, to getting it where it's supposed to go. So behind the scenes, you have all of these impact points. And at any given time, if the impact point fails, there's a pretty good chance that it's going to fail at the frontline touch point. In a warehouse, for example, the person in a warehouse may say, I never deal with the customer. I don't ever see the customer. I never talked to a customer in my life. But the guy in the warehouse, his or her job may be to go pull an item off the shelf and pack it in a box properly, similar to what we talked about earlier in the show, where when the customer opens it up, they can see it's filled, it's been protected. And by the way, that warehouse person, if they don't put the right part in the box, or if there was 5 items and they only put 4 in, what's happened is they've now created a moment of misery for that customer who's got to call up, complain that something's broken or complain that something's missing. So really that person in the warehouse is a pretty good, important role when it comes to the customer experience. Maybe it's a person in the accounting department who doesn't properly invoice a customer. The customer opens it up and it's wrong. That's a moment of misery. If they took the time to do it right the first time, the customer wouldn't have to call, wouldn't have to put the people and the employees through doing a search and checking things and making sure, only to find out it was wrong. So once again, somebody in accounting, somebody in the warehouse, somebody in payroll, doesn't matter. Everybody has a role. So by looking at not just the touch points at the top, but the impact points that drive the touch points, you can prove that every department and therefore every employee has impact on the customer experience.
Well, I think that's a great point to make, and it kind of brings everything full circle. And it highlights the intrinsic link between customer experience and process. And I've spent a lot of my career dealing with process people saying you need to focus on the customer. Now I spend a lot of my time with customer people saying you need to focus on your processes. But it's realizing that they're not different things. It's all just stuff that's happening. Some of the stuff happens with the customer, some of the stuff happens without the customer, and realizing that the things that happen with the customer are those moments of truth, those touch points. And as you say, they could be a moment of misery or a moment of magic. But it's taking that understanding a step further, like you were talking with Google, that it's not just every interaction the customer has with your company, it's every interaction the customer has with the entire experience in and around your company. And so Google talk about this really well. There's a book called The Zero Moment of Truth. I'm not sure if you've read it. And it's that understanding that the moment you become aware that you need to achieve something, usually the very next thing you do, the very first thing you do that kicks off your entire experience is go and Google something. So that's that Google kicks off a lot of the experiences with every company in the world. And I think in with that as well, what you were saying, the vision, having that vision there, so the person in the warehouse knows that what they do on a day-to-day basis, how it impacts the customer and how it impacts on customer success is vital to be able to make all of this work together. So I think that insight there is amazing.